Continue our conversation about manifest destiny. We're going to kind of shift now away from pure diplomacy and more towards kind of a cultural takeover almost when we talk about how Texas becomes part of the United States. And so to do this, we do some kind of back history, some referring back to some earlier units here about who controlled what parts of the of North America before the United States becomes a country. And so Texas, right, the modern day state of Texas, that region of Texas, was originally part of the Spanish Empire. When the Spanish gained control of kind of the central part of North America and the western part of North America, they control Texas. By 1821, though, Mexico is a new nation. They win their independence from the Spanish Empire, and they claim the territory of Texas. The region of Texas was very sparsely or very smallly populated by Europeans, meaning kind of white Europeans, Americans, things like that, and Mexicans, meaning the Spanish Mexicans that were there, not kind of Native American indigenous people. In addition to that, there's also a very powerful presence of Native Americans in the Texas region. In particular, the Comanche and the Apache Indians are very powerful. And in fact, some historians even argue that the Comanche really were the ones up until the 1850s, 1860s, were the ones who were actually in control of Texas. The Spanish claimed the territory, but really it was the Comanche that had control over it. And that's pretty much true until the United States takes control in the 1850s. And these Comanche and Apache Indians would constantly be raiding and attacking Mexican settlements and missions, which were used to kind of convert the native populations. And this led Mexican government to try to address the issue. Right? They wanted to kind of get control of the land, and they thought one way of doing that is to offer large land grants or large pieces of land for very cheap prices to Americans who were willing to settle this territory. And the idea was that they would populate the region, which would kind of weaken the power of the Native American Comanche group. They would improve the Mexican economy by supporting agriculture and trade, but they would also, like I said, they would limit the power of the Comanche. Soon, though, very shortly after the Americans start settling there, the Anglo population, meaning the English-speaking population, the white European, white American population, it quickly surpasses the Mexican population. Because, like I said, the Mexican region of Texas was very sparsely populated. There's only a few thousand people in all of the region of Texas. If you think about Texas today, there's millions of people who live in Texas. It's the second largest state population-wise, and there's still so much open land there, right? So it's a very large piece of land. And so to think there's only a few thousand means there's practically nobody in Texas. And Americans start coming in, the English-speaking population starts coming in, and they quickly are more populous than the original native Mexican population. And so over time, after a couple of years, by 1830, Mexico really begins to regret welcoming in these Americans. They see that the Americans are kind of taking control. Mexicans are bringing cultural differences, the language difference, right? They're not Spanish speaking. Religion, they're predominantly Protestant when Mexicans are predominantly Catholic. And also slavery. These, excuse me, these white Americans are bringing in the practice of slavery to Texas. Which the Mexicans do not like. In 1821, once Mexico gains their independence, one of the first things they do is actually abolish slavery in Mexico. And so they are anti-slavery. They don't want it to happen, and they don't like the fact that it is happening in their territory. And so by 1830, Mexico closes the border with the United States, which is, the irony there should kind of not be lost on anybody. They try to keep Americans out of Mexican territory, which at this time Texas was. But they're limited in their ability to actually enforce this. And even once the border is officially closed in 1830, the white American population, the Anglo population of Mexico, doubles within a 4-year period after this closure. So it's clearly not effective, right? If the population is doubling, even though you're closing the borders aren't really closed. At this time, a man named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is the leader of Mexico, and he has arrested a man named Stephen Austin. Stephen Austin is kind of like the leader of the Texans, right? The white Texans who actually went to Mexico City to talk to Santa Anna, and he has him arrested because he accused him of inciting rebellion. And in reality, the arresting of Stephen Austin is what leads to Texas officially rebelling against Mexico. And this name Austin should look familiar when I'm talking about Texas, because Austin is the capital city of Texas, named after Stephen Austin. Right, and so the war lasts. This rebellion lasts a few years, very short actually, and it's a couple of famous battles. One of the most famous battles, ironically, in Texas and American history, is the Alamo. And the Alamo was an old mission, a kind of a fort and settlement that was set up to kind of help convert Native Americans that had since been abandoned. But the Texans had taken up arms there, and San Antonio, the general and president of Mexico, attacks the Alamo and kills all the Texans that were stationed there. Famous people like David Crockett, right? If you guys ever heard that name, he was a senator from Kentucky at one point, but also fighting for the Texans, was killed in this battle. So a really famous battle, but it was a bloodbath for the Texans. They did not win this battle. But it does become a rallying cry because kind of the brutal way that it was done, kind of killing people even after it was clear they had lost, led to the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo," and this kind of united the Texans and was used as a kind of a morale booster when going to war against the Mexican forces. And so a couple months later, the Battle of San Jacinto, Sam Houston, an important figure in Texas history, and the city is named after Houston as well, led a successful defeat of Santa Anna, and he actually captures the general and the president at that time at the battle. And before letting him go, he requires him to sign the Treaty of Velasco, which then recognizes Texas independence. And so, after just a few short years of fighting, the white Americans in Texas, the white settlers in Texas, become their own country, the Republic of Texas, also known as the Lone Star Republic, right? Because they modeled everything they did, they modeled after the United States, including their flag, right? This flag should look similar to our flag, right? There's red and white and blue, and there's a star, but instead of having X amount of stars for each state, there's one single star because it's just one state. And that's why it's known as the Lone Star Republic. Sam Houston is elected president. He helps pass a constitution, a Texas constitution that's very similar to the United States Constitution. And then in 1838, just 2 years after the war is over and Texas gains its independence, Houston actually invites the United States to annex Texas. And annex means to make part of. So he wants the United States to take control over the Texas region. There is hesitancy to do this, though. Northern states fear that this is going to, once again, tip that balance that was struck during the Missouri Compromise between free and slave states. The fear is that this will now become a slave state because slavery was already well established in Texas. So there's that hesitancy from northern states. There's also the fear that by annexing Texas, the United States would be really angering the Mexican government, and they were right on with that. But regardless, a couple years later, in 1845, the process is finally kind of completed, and Texas does become the 28th state in the United States. And as you're going to kind of learn next lecture, Mexico is very unhappy with this, right? And it is eventually going to lead to the Mexican-American War.